This video is sponsored by Game Toppers. Turn your own kitchen or dining room table into a premium portable game solution at a fraction of the cost. Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 782. Today we're going to talk about The British Way. The full name is Counterinsurgency at the End of Empire. And this is designed by Stefan Rangasis. I think I got that name right. And what this is the first of a multi-pack coin game. So if you're not familiar with coin games, Cuba Libre is one, Andean Abyss, Fire in the Lake, Distant Plain, Colonial Twilight, Gandhi. There's a whole bunch of them at this point. And what those typically are is sort of an insurgency and a counterinsurgency, the coin counterinsurgency faction kind of trying to stop the uprising. And a lot of times they're set in modern conflicts, especially like Cuba Libre was the Cuban Revolution. Andean Abyss was a whole lot of different factions, cartels, Colombian government, Colombian communist left-wing government, and then a far-right faction. And typically they're up to 4 players and you're playing different factions. A lot of them have been sort of cited as kind of inspiration for the Root game from Cole Wehrle. And so they don't really play like Root if you've never played one, but you can see kind of the similarities here. Now what this is a multi-pack, so it's 4 different coin games, but you can play them as a campaign, so over 4 different stages. And as the game name implies, it's kind of during the fall. Well, fall is a strange word, but the kind of the end of the British Empire, and kind of Britain kind of retracting from its reach across various parts of the globe. And so it's 4 games, and the first one that you would play in the campaign would be Palestine, and then Malaya, and then Kenya, and then Cyprus. And you can play them individually, and they're each about an hour or 2, and then or you can play them as a campaign. So let's go down to the table and I'll show you. I'm not going to really explain like coin as a whole. So if you're familiar with coin, this video is kind of going to be more up your alley. If you're not familiar with coin, I will say this at the outset though. While I won't get into the rules in detail, I'm going to talk more about like the differences and some of the quirks and stuff and the differences between each of the 4 games, just so people can get a general sense. I will say this at the beginning, and I'll talk more about this at the end, that this is probably the best introduction to coin game that there is. And I'll explain more about that at the end, but just know that in the beginning. So then you can kind of get maybe more of a flavorful sense when I do the kind of the walkthroughs about how things kind of work. And then I'll come back and tell you more what I think about it. Okay, before I jump into each of the different games, let me give you an overall kind of quick idea what you get in the box. Now you get 4 of these maps. These are double-sided. Here you can see the first game you would play here in Palestine. On the other side we have Malaya and so on. And then you have 4 different rule books for each of the different games that you will play. There's also a campaign booklet which gives you really simple rules for running the campaign and stringing all 4 games together. I just want to make a quick note about the rule books. They're very cool because they are formatted like almost identically, and then of course they have different like background information, explanations of some of the event cards, and the general sort of time period everything takes place to give you a sense of the history. And they each have like little strategic tips in that section, and everything is broken down. So once you kind of jump in and maybe play Palestine for your first game, each of the subsequent games is going to be very familiar. Like they're not deviating in terms of presentation very much, even though mechanically they might do little nuanced riffs on each other. So you get that, and then of course up here you have this campaign board here, and actually have played through a full campaign of this, and I just left it like this because this is how it ended up. And so over the campaign you've got here the Imperial Prestige, and it ended up in the middle, so that's kind of the historical outcome. And you can see I've marked some of the different spots there with kind of how each of the different games ended up. So different parts of the way the games end, and there's also kind of a general sort of event deck that's just for the campaign. We'll maneuver this or allow the players to make choices. So if it ends up in the blue, then British Empire wins. If it ends up in red, then the British Empire loses because all the insurgencies have brought them down, and among other things. And if it ends up in the middle, the rules kind of say you can either look at it as kind of a, let's call it a Diet Coke victory for the British Empire, but you can kind of discuss that. It says with among the players, it also kind of says it could either be considered a draw. And the way I kind of look at it is if it's in 5, 6, or 7, let's call that a draw. If it's an 8, 9, or 10, we'll say that's like a minor victory for Britain. I'll talk more about that at the end, but that's not really that important. And there's another thing here. You can see this other token here, this one right here. So every time you start a game, you're going to put it right there in the middle. And then each game is going to have 3 scoring rounds or propaganda rounds. Well, at the first propaganda round, the first scoring, the British player makes a choice to either leave that token there, which is called stay the course, or they can move it to the left to stand firm, or over here to the right, which is concessions. And it's almost like placing a bet. So if you move it one way or the other, or you choose to leave it, then it's going to stay in that position for the rest of the game. And then based on the outcome of the game, you will either gain or lose more points. So if you kind of go hard in the paint, so to speak, then you could stand to gain more prestige, but you can also risk losing more. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. So that will happen if you're playing the campaign. Then off the side here, you can see we've got the 4 different decks there. Each of them has 3 scoring cards, so they all play the same. There is one variant there, and this is the Malaya. You can play with kind of a larger deck, so typically you shuffle up 3 groups of 6 cards. So in each of the 3 groups, you put 1 scoring card. So effectively, you'll have a 21 card deck for that, but there is kind of sort of like a longer variant for Malaya there to shuffle in. I think it's 8 cards per stack, so you can have a little bit longer one, and I think that might be the way to play that. I'm not sure. We can talk more about that in the review, but you won't use all the cards in a given deck in every game. So next time you play Palestine, for example, you might have a somewhat different setup of cards in there, but they all play basically the same. And then here is the kind of the campaign event deck. You can see there's End of Empire early period and then End of Empire late period. And so before each game, you will flip a card like this and kind of do what it says basically. And then during the first 2 scoring rounds of a game, you'll flip new cards. And then after you've completed Palestine and then Malaya, then you will jump over to the late period. And then you will use that for the last 2 games there. Now the other thing that you can do, and this is just a very minor bummer because the tables are in the books too, but there's tables on the back here of this campaign sheet. And before each game, you can roll up on those tables, and that will just slightly tweak the starting conditions of each of the games. And so if you're playing with the campaign, you've got this up, you don't want to mess the pieces up. There's not really a lot of pieces to mess up, so it's not a big deal. So you can flip that over and roll on the table, but the table's also in the campaign book, so you can look there. And even if you're not playing the campaign, I don't know, I think that's a cool way to do it. You can kind of ignore this deck, of course. There's not really any use for this unless you're playing the campaign, but you could roll up on those tables to just, play a one-off game and then have a little bit of an interesting, starting setup that isn't the dictated setup of the game. So I'll go through the different games just to give you a sense. It'll take forever if I get into too much detail. But first you'll start with Palestine, like I said. And the one thing you can note here, if you've played coin games before, you can see these different numbers on the different regions and the cities. Now that is not the population. Usually that's considered a population in a lot of coin games. What that is kind of what we call the sabotage value. So you get points during the scoring rounds if you've got these either sabotaged, or maybe sometimes you'll have terror in the cities. And those will score points for the opposition, for the insurgents, if they have those there. The other interesting thing about this is there are no resources in this case. So what can happen in this game and also in Cyprus is you have got these intel chits. So these are only used in those 2 games, and these have different values on the back from 0 to 2. And sometimes you can spend these for their value. You keep them face down and then kind of pull them either out of a bag or a cup or to shuffle them up. Or you can just spend them for the chit and ignore the values to do extra things, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then in this case, the Irguns, this is the Jewish rebellion forces in here, you will have these weapons caches. And this is similar in Cyprus as well, where if you have these in different spots, allow you to kind of do beefed up actions and things like that, or you can also spend them to take extra actions, which I'll talk about. So that's the interesting thing about this, is there is no resources. Everybody can either do your main actions in up to 3 spaces, or a limited operation in 1 space, and so on. And there's also no victory points per se. In every game, in all 4 games, you have this political will tracker here. And so this will start up, I think it starts up at 18, yep, in this game. And basically how this game works, and same with Cyprus, is if at the end of one of the first 2 scoring rounds, this is at 0, then instant defeat for the British Army. Also at the end of the last scoring round. And if you get all the way through calculating the scoring in that last round, and it's anywhere above 0, then, Britain wins. But again, that will be different for the campaign, and I forget the exact range. I think if it's anywhere between 1 and 5, it's what you would call a scuttle. Or if it's at 0 at any point in the game, at any scoring point in the game, then it's a surrender. If it's 6 or above, I think up to 17 or something, then it would be an exit. And then if it's a certain higher, then it would be an influence. And so you will take one of those 4 outcomes, and then you can just mark it on the map up there, and then you will adjust prestige based on, again, where the British kind of placed their bet after that first scoring round there. So all of the 4 games are based off of this political will. And where that ends up, you'll see how it works a little bit differently, but it's always just this tracker here, which is basically like a seesaw of victory points, so to speak. And as well, what is very similar, but not exactly the same across all 4 games, is this initiative track. Now, if you're familiar with coin games, you're always, one faction goes and picks either limited operation, which means you can only act in 1 space, or the event on the card that's currently up, or they can do operations and special activity, which is kind of like you can do it in this game, particularly in Palestine. You do it in up to 3 places, and then you can do a special activity. And so what that does in the other coin games kind of limits what the next person does. Well, this is very similar, but it works slightly different. And so what happens is, so if in this game, Palestine always starts the game off with the initiative on the left there. And they will start off each round after scoring on the left. And that works the same way in Cyprus as well. The other 2 games, this will stay the same however it is, based on where it is in the scoring round. And so what happens if Palestine chooses to do the event, which they would just do whatever's on the card, then they will do it, and then the Britain player is limited to either doing a limited operation or the operation and special activity. The thing to keep in mind there is this may sound cooler and better, they can do more stuff, but if they do limited op, what's going to happen is they'll do their 1 operation, and then they'll come back down here in the order on this track. So they'll be able to go first on the next card that comes up here. And the other thing that is different from other coin games is you don't see the next card, you only see the current card. So it's a little bit of a bet in a way, and so on. Now the other thing that you can do is, let's say this card comes up, and I'm not going to read it, but let's say it's really good for the Irgun player here. And I know as the British player, I have no interest in that event, and I don't want to necessarily do a limited op and give them the event, and maybe I'm thinking, oh, I could go here and I could do a lot more operations and give them the event, but I don't want to give them the event at all, it's too good. So what I can do is I can go to this event spot, I don't have to trigger the event, and then I can effectively pass. Okay, now passing is going to work a little bit different in each of the different games, but this same mechanism of going to a spot and passing and basically blocking it is valid in all the games. And you could even go here, block this big op special activity, big move, if you want to do that as well, and then maybe this player goes there. So no matter if you pass or not, you're still going to maintain turn order based off of the order that you are up there. Now in this game, when you pass, the British player will draw a random intel chit, and they can take a look at it there. They got a value of 2 in that case, cool. And what you can do with intel chits as the British player is do operations in an additional space. So even as the British player, if I did a limited op, which again is usually only 1 space, I can discard one of these intel chits to do a 2nd space. So if I was doing some stuff in Tel Aviv, and then maybe I can do in Haifa as well. If you did a regular operations plus special activity, instead of 3, you could do 4 spaces. Now the other thing that these intel chits are going to be used for example, is you can discard them for the value, and in the particular thing, I think it's the assault action is the name of it, then you can actually assault underground guerrillas, because if you remember from the other coin games, if we have this guerrilla here, it is, or insurgent, I don't think they're called guerrillas here actually, underground insurgent, then that's underground. If they do something like they cause some terror or sabotage or some other activity or move a certain way, then they will become active. Typically you can only assault and remove active insurgents, but in this game you can remove undergrounds equal to that number there, so you can save them for that. So that's another good reason to maybe pass, is like, I want some intel chits to either spend for bigger actions later or for getting them for that value. Now when the Irgun passes, they can do what's called a rob action. And a rob action is basically you roll some dice and add up some stuff but you try to put out one of these arms caches here, and you can get them out. And so these aren't bases like they are in the other coin games. They are weapons caches and arms. And so when you get these out, they can act as, well, they kind of act like a base, because you can start to deploy things either in this spot or adjacent to it. And depending on which of the games that we're playing, they can also generate more resources for you when you go to do scoring and stuff. Now, the tricky thing with Palestine is if the British player were to come in here and, remove, let's say we got these in here and we did an assault, so we removed that, and then we remove this one, then the British player will then score the political will up here. It'll start to go back up for every one of those weapons caches that they remove. So you're kind of putting out, a little tent pole to sort of spread your forces out and give you some resources, but it's also becoming a target for the British player. So that's a very interesting dynamic with how this works in this game, and how we kind of manage and restrain the amount of available actions for the players without there actually being any resources that you're generating and spending, directly. And also I should say that the Irgun player can also spend these when they're doing the limited op or the main operations to do an additional one. Now, speaking of which, you have this Haganah track here, and what this represents is kind of a third Jewish faction. So you, as the Irgun player, you're playing kind of combined the two more extreme, let's say. And there was a third one here that was kind of negotiating kind of through both sides. And so this will start up here. As this moves down, it will start to sort of effectively capture or remove pieces that are available to the insurgent player. So as this moves down even further, we'll put more tokens there. The other thing that it will do is if it is all the way up here, then the Irgun player gets +1 to all their operations anyway. So whether it's a limited op or a special op, and that's on top of the weapons cache that they could spend. When it gets down here, then the British player can take a special activity to help generate more of these intel chits, which again gives them more resources to spend and stuff like that. And there's some other events and things like that that will interact with this, but that's kind of an interesting, neat little spot there. But basically what the insurgent player is trying to do is, like I said, create sabotage and terror, kind of force away the British player to put curfews out, and so there's both players can kind of interact with those, and the British player will be trying to remove all of these. And when we get to a scoring round, the political will there is going to adjust up or down based on the net sort of result of all of the different items that are out here. And I should say the game comes with these player aids for each of the games. So there's two. So we've got the two Palestine ones there, and they're double-sided. So even if I'm the British player there, I can flip this over and take a look and see what the Irgun operations are all about. And so that's very, very handy. And this is really all you need to know is basically everything on this side. Now there's also player aids here for these different propaganda rounds. So here we have the Palestine one. And so you very simply will just walk through these when you get to the scoring card. And there's a nice handy reference at the bottom of each of these for each game to show you what will raise and lower political will. So you kind of know, okay, what do I need to be doing? Well, if I'm the Irgun player, I need to be doing my propagandize, try to get the other player to do mass detention events. And then during the propaganda round, the scoring round, okay, I need sabotages in district spaces, the railways, cities, terror in cities and so on. And then as the British player in this case, I don't want the railways to have any sabotages, and each city without any sabotage or terror is going to actually increase my political will. So it gives you a good sense, and each of the games have these, they're double-sided, to give you a sense, because you're going to sit down and go, well, what do I do? Well, this gives you the exact direction of what to do there. Okay, let's kind of go through the others. So the next one we're here is Malaya, and this is like your most straightforward kind of old school coin system game. So let's zoom in. Now here you've got various different regions and cities and so on, and what you will be doing in this case is you will have control of these cities, and that's going to be based on whoever has the most pieces in here. Let's say it's something like that. So this obviously be British control, and then also you will have support and opposition and that kind of thing. So you'd be taking special activities and spending resources in this case, because there are resources in this one, and those will be tracked over here on the right. So you'll be able to gain and spend resources there. And that's for moving your troops and your police and your insurgents around and trying to gin up or gin down opposition or support there. And so your calculation there, the scoring round, is going to be a lot like the other coin games in that case. So you're going to be basically moving the political will up and down based on the difference there between opposition spaces versus not. A couple of interesting things here that I think are a little bit different. They may exist in some coins I have not played, but you have really just the one city here, and then you have the two economic centers, and you can see there's no control or opposition or support there. But as the British player, you want to prevent those from being sabotaged, and as the opposition forces, you want to try to sabotage them. The other thing up here is you can see there's a Thailand space, and the British players can never go in there because that's another country, and that can act as a good sort of base of operations to kind of get started and start to flow pieces down as well. It kind of gives you sort of a foothold to kind of generate the resources and the quote-unquote troops and stuff and everything that you need. But this one is kind of like the most kind of straightforward coin game. Like it's probably the most like it's the most like the most other coin games in that regard. So the interesting track here is this commander track there. And so this is going to move after the different scoring rounds, and this is going to just affect some of the actions that the British player can do. But again, initiative track, all that's the same. When you pass in this case, then you just get resources. So I can move to a spot, pass, and then get some resources depending on which faction I'm playing. And similar to some of the other coin games, there's some different types of terrain here. So it's going to be more or less difficult to flush out and remove insurgent pieces based off if it's jungle or mountain and that kind of thing. So there'll be some stuff to watch out for there. But yeah, this one's very, very straightforward if you've played another coin game before. Now next we have the Kenya map. And this one or Palestine, honestly, I'll talk in the review, might be my favorite one because this one's also very different. This one's interesting because the British player doesn't have any resources, but the Kenyan player will. And there is one city in here, and we have the same kind of control and well, it's not like support. So you have loyal and neutral and resist. So it's a little bit different, but it's also the same. And so the interesting thing about that is the Kenyan player is trying to get out. In these cases, they are bases that are sort of contiguous with Nairobi. And so you want to be able to draw a line, be able to take your supply action, or ship supply special activity. And the way you do that is by having pieces that you'll be able to draw through to back to Nairobi here. So you need to at least have either guerrilla or insurgent or resist. And so when you do that, then you're going to generate resources for your supply line. So as the British player, you're trying to break that, because if the Kenyan player is able to generate resources, they're going to be able to do a whole lot of stuff, like almost as much as you. But it is very fragile. And you'll see some of these spaces here, like these zero spaces, they're not really worth anything like for scoring, but they can act as kind of like hideouts in a way and bases of operations for the Kenyan player. So the British player will be kind of wanting to break those up as well. Now, the difference here, you can see the initiative tracks at the top there. When the Kenyan player passes, they'll get a resource, just like the previous game, Malaya. Now, when the British player passes, they'll be manipulating this pipeline track. And what this is basically how much of a hard line the British player is taking. So as this is over here, then it effectively reduces the ability of the British player to do a lot of things to try to win the game. To get in there and do relocations and reprisals and remove terror markers and sort of reduce the amount of resistance that's out there on the board. You can't really do a lot if it's over here on the left. But the more it is on the right, the more the British player can do. Remember, the British player doesn't have any resources. They have like infinite resources. But every time you do one of those two actions, you're going to roll a die. If it's under that, then your political will is just going to keep dropping every time you do that and roll under a certain amount. And again, there's other cards and things that will interact with that. So again, this is kind of a different way of keeping, tabs on the British, so they can't just do whatever they want. The other thing that they can do is you can see some of these population values here. Now the British can actually manipulate those and reduce those down. So what that does is effectively there could be resistance here, but it's not going to really hurt you as bad because that number is not going to be, it's not going to be multiplied sort of by that number. So that's the thing that you do. And so when you do that, and I'll talk more about this in the review, you'll take that relocation action. So you'll kind of replace people. What you're doing is villagizing. It's like a special word. It's a villagization. So effectively, moving people into camps, and then you're replacing them with police, which is interesting. So that's what they kind of do to sort of thwart that. But again, that is all sort of dictated by this track here, which again, it can hurt your political will. Now the last one here is Cyprus, which is another island in the Mediterranean Sea here. And this one is almost exactly like the Palestine one, with the rules, the intel, the curfews, the different bases and sort of weapons caches and so on. I didn't really talk about the prison in Palestine, but there's also a prison in that. So when you eliminate the insurgent discs or the cylinders, I should say, some will go to prison, some will go to available. And so the prison ones will only come out so often. So that's a way to kind of slow down the insurgent player. Now the main kind of sort of tactical difference here is there's no railroads in here that are kind of an interesting tactical thing. This one is more about like the mountains, and some of the others have this well because you're kind of like trying to hide and make those like a good base of operation. So that's kind of the terrain like kind of consideration here, and that's kind of the main difference between this and Palestine is the mountains versus the railroads. And a lot of times, and I should say in the Palestine one and then also in this one, sometimes you don't have to necessarily move things adjacently as well. You can just pick them up and move them wherever you want. So that's kind of an interesting idea too with some of that stuff. And the other difference is up here is the international opinion track. Now in Palestine you had the Haganah track, which interacted with a lot of different things. This one really only interacts with the smuggle operation, which is part of what will put out these little weapons caches and these bases. And then it will just reduce directly the British political will every scoring round based on whatever number it's on. So if it's on 2, it just goes down 2. So it's a little bit more blunt force, straightforward, number that the British player and the Cyprus player has to take into account. But that will just directly whack your political will down. And again, it's also another one of these where it's either British lose or they don't. Oh, and I didn't show on the other maps. Let's go look at one real quick. I'll just pull the Kenya one up here. So this one gives you a range. So if it's like right here at 10, then it's a draw. Where if it's down here, the insurgent player wins. And then if it's up here, then the British player wins. And then there's an instant victory as well if it gets too far in either direction. So it still has the same kind of feel, but it's not just like 0 or nothing. That's a little bit, you get like a little bit of a window with these. Anyway, so that's kind of a brief sort of overview of each of the different maps and stuff. Okay, so that is a little bit of an overview of the British way. Let's just jump into my pillars of review. So the first one we'll talk about is player count. Now this is an only 2-player game on the box. Unlike other coin games, there is no like solo bot or solo mode or anything like that. But I did play through the whole campaign, all 4 maps, solo. Now it's easy to play solo if you're, somewhat of a war gamer. A lot of times people will play these solo, and it's very easy to do it in this case because you're only seeing the one event card come up. You don't see the next one. So it's not like a lot of brain overload. you know, in terms of like if I did this now and then this happened there. So you look at the card, you see who has the initiative, and then you just try to make the best choice for that faction, and then you play the other guy. And so it worked really good solo. I really liked it. I am excited to play this 2-player. I've got a game sort of scheduled, tentatively, to play through some of these over Zoom. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I think, I don't know, solo was great. I really liked the solo. It was fantastic. Like, I've been thinking about how you could do a bot, and you'd have to make like 4 completely different bots, and it might just get a little bit too involved. I don't know, but to me it plays fine as is solo, and I don't really have any problems with it. You're kind of more playing it for kind of the historical immersion side of it when you do that, and just kind of, you know, getting a feel for the game. But I can really see how this could be a lot of fun with 2. Now, playtime, I think the box is 1 to 2 hours, and that's like per game, and 100%. Once you kind of get the hang of this, and a lot of the games it's kind of different, and I've played a lot of coin games over the last several years, so it was really easy to get into. I could really see these being knocked out in about an hour or so. Not too much longer than that, especially if you've got 2 players that are experienced with the system in general, or just even with the individual games. They do play very, very quick, because it's like, you know, basically 6 cards, score, 6 cards, score, 6 cards, score. So there's about 18 turns, right? And sometimes your turns are really quick. They're not super involved. So it does play really, really snappily. Now, in terms of like starting to compare this to other games, obviously I would compare it to other coin games, but I'll kind of compare all of the 4 games internally to each other as well. I kind of hinted at that a little bit in the walkthrough. Now, what sets this apart, obviously, is the multi-pack thing. With the 4 different games in a box, that's already different, but then it's also a campaign thing that you can play, which is really cool. And this has some stuff that I haven't seen in other coin games, but I know exist now after talking to a friend of mine. He says, oh, well, that's in Colonial Twilight, or that's in, you know, Gandhi or whatever. And so, but for somebody that's only played, I think I played like the first 5 of them or so, there is some different stuff here. So if you've not played every coin game, you're definitely going to see, you know, cool new different interactions, which is really neat. And I really like, for example, how like there's no resources really in Palestine or Cyprus, and how in Kenya only the insurgent has resources but Britain doesn't. So even that kind of small detail there really affects the gameplay and makes it really interesting to does a couple of things. It brings you into the theme in a lot of ways, because, you know, obviously the British Empire had like every resource at its disposal at the time, and kind of that imbalance of, you know, economic power and stuff really comes into play, and it makes it really interesting to see how those dynamics work, and how, you know, the insurgent factions were kind of, you know, scraping and clawing to get resources to do, you know, whatever they could do. So that kind of interesting dynamic there is really cool as well. And so I'll just kind of walk through the 4 games. So I think my favorite is either the Palestine one or Kenya. The Palestine one I really like for a lot of the reasons I talked about, with the kind of funky resource management idea, and how you kind of, in that one where you pass and you get the weapons cache or you get the intel, and that's going to allow you to beef up the extra actions. But I also like the dynamic of the Haganah track, where you have this sort of faction that's sort of existing in between the 2 players, that you're sort of playing tug of war with to either help Britain or help the other Jewish factions. And so that's really cool. That's like kind of a third player in a way that you're sort of manipulating or trying to get to come to your side a little bit better. And that's also directly affecting what you're capable of on the board, which is really, really cool, in like a big way. So that's just a fun place to be in. Now, where on the other hand, where the Cyprus game is, it's kind of the same game as the Palestine game, but that track, the international opinion track, is arguably less interesting, because it's just, oh, you lose points, you know, based on where it is on the track. Not 100%. I mean, it affects the smuggle operation, which is a big part of the Cyprus insurgents' activities. But it's not quite as dynamic as the Palestine one, and I think Cyprus is probably my least favorite of the 4, but I still really like it. I think the train tracks and how that affects adjacency and movement is a lot more dynamic and fluid and interesting and fun than the 2 mountain spaces in Cyprus. But though I will say this about Cyprus, because playing through it as the campaign, having that like heavy hammer kind of, hanging over the head of the British player, because having that just kind of chip away at your political will based on where you're at the end of the campaign, when you're playing it through that perception, that's actually pretty cool. So the game is like a little bit less on its own interesting compared to the Palestine game, but when you're looking at it in the context of playing it through all 4 games, that to me added some tension there in that kind of last game to kind of see where that campaign stuff would end up. And I'll talk about the campaign in more detail in a minute. So you got Palestine and Cyprus, first and last game, and it's kind of nice to see that kind of bring it home, because the Palestine way is kind of the really uniquest way of playing the game, probably. And so they kind of bringing that back home and playing it very, very similar with Cyprus was cool. Now the second game, Malaya, it's the most, like I said, the most straightforward coinish game. It's a lot like just any other coin game, with support and opposition and resources. Both sides have resources, and you have your control and area control of the regions and all that stuff. So that was cool. I mean, it's just like, it's playing, if you wanted to pick one of these and play it, I would say Palestine, because it's the simplest, but it's also just the most crazy too. Most dynamic, probably the most replayable. I don't know. I think that's my favorite one, but we'll get to Kenya in a minute. But if you wanted to kind of like learn coin games, probably Malaya is the best one, because that's most like other coin games from what I can see. Again, I've not played all of them yet, but so that's nice to be able to play like a straightforward coin game in like an hour and a half or so. So I really like it for that, because it just got all of that same coin stuff. Now I will say with the Malaya one, I was going to mention this one does have a variant for the deck building side of it that will make the game a little bit longer and make the deck a little bit bigger. I think that might be a good spot to put it in, because you can, I think, again, I've only played each of these once, but I think as the British player, you can get out to kind of a very strong lead in that game. And that was probably the most lopsided of the games that I played. The others were pretty tight. And I think it's almost like there's not enough time for the Malaya player to get to do stuff before that propaganda, that scoring card comes. So I would definitely at least recommend folks try that variant. I have not tried it yet, but just based on that, I was like, man, the British player is just out to a good foothold so early in these scoring rounds that it's really hard. It doesn't really give you enough time to really pull the reins back in. And they talk about it in the rulebook. It's also like the longest conflict of these, because there's some overlap between each of them. And so it's kind of like, the rules say it's focused on the early parts of that combat, that interaction. So I don't know if really the cards are supposed to meant to stretch out to cover the whole scenario or not. But anyway, that'd be my only kind of caveat there with the Malaya one. And so the last one is Kenya. So this, either the Kenya or Palestine, is tied for my favorite. The Kenya one is just so dynamically interesting in terms of the way the map works, because you've got the one town, the one city, Nairobi, and you've got the 2 mountains, Mount Kenya and the other mountain, whatever it's called, up north. And you have this kind of interesting sort of funnel with some flanks around it. And so you're kind of like driving, it's like this wave of insurgents kind of going into Nairobi. And this one actually triggered me to read a little bit more of the history in this one than I did the others. And in history, they basically stayed out of Nairobi, the insurgents did. They kind of left that alone. They didn't want to kind of disturb, city life, I guess, and that kind of thing. And so it was very much fought out in the rest of the country. But there's some real interesting things about, and the coin systems always do this, where you're trying to say, well, what if we tried this differently than how history did it? And that kind of gives you a way to kind of play it out. And so I had some fun with that. But also, this one actually has almost like a front line to it, because the front line kind of moves, to closer or further away than Nairobi. And then you've got the flanks on the side, like in the east and the west, that you have to kind of watch out for. So it felt like almost like a more traditional war game in a way, where you had this kind of all these things, you know, flanks, front lines, supply lines, all that kind of stuff. So I really, really liked that. And it was really cool to see how the other dynamic of Kenyans having resources, having to manage the supply lines, and the British Empire having infinite resources in a way, but what their actions were limited by was how much of a hard ass they were on the people, because this one is kind of brought it home sort of thematically and personally, because one thing that happens is the British player will manipulate that pipeline track to unlock a lot of these relocate and reprisal actions, and that's going to allow them to try to win, but it also makes them susceptible to losing political will and, again, prestige in the world, because they kind of turn into demons at that point in terms of how they're trying to control the populace. It's not this, and the rules make several mentions of this, it wasn't like this all like, you know, easygoing, like hearts and minds, we're just trying to win over the people's, you know, spirit in a way. It was like they were actually super violent in at least a few instances, if not many. And so you're playing with that kind of hard line edge there on the pipeline track, and then that's blowing back and having repercussions. But effectively what you're doing as well, when I think it's the relocate, is you're adjusting some of those population values. And so you're replacing these people when you do that with police. And so that is just, that it's like the clearest presentation of all four of the games about what's going on here. Because you're also like moving in these British settlers and stuff like that are coming into this land and all that stuff. So you're dropping the population value and then replacing them with the blue cubes, which are the police. So you're swapping people for a police state, you know, and that doesn't get much more clear than that, like what's going on there. And so I appreciated the game for that, and then kind of addressing that like right in your face as well. And so that just really makes kind of the impact of that to you as a person emotionally, whatever, through all the mechanics. I was like, okay, this is really something else. So I think that one kind of puts it right up there with the Palestine one, which I think is more interesting mechanically, but this one had a little bit more of an impact, and it feels like a war game, you know, like a traditional war game. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the campaign part and how that kind of works. And that works really well. I would say, for me, the best way to play this game is with the campaign, although there's some caveats to that. Now, the main takeaway from the campaign is two parts. One is you're rolling up on kind of the different setup table for each of the maps. So, you know, you set the game up normally based on the different rule book, but then you will roll and then something will slightly change, some kind of like little historical type of variant, which I think could be played without the campaign, rolling up on those tables, just to kind of, you know, throw some extra spice and flavor into the game and kind of make it a little bit more dynamic in that way. The other part is you have the event cards. So you will draw one of those at the beginning of the game and in the first two scoring rounds of each game. And those will directly affect your prestige, your campaign track. And a lot of those are very anti-Britain player, because it's going to help start to reduce that. So it kind of balances that out a little bit, because, you know, as a British player, you're probably in a stronger position in most of the games anyway. And so the events kind of help balance that out. And it also kind of symbolizes you juggling like all of these other things that aren't depicted in the game. Like there's revolution in Burma and stuff going on in India and different things like that. And so it really ties into like all the other things that you're trying to manipulate and juggle and, you know, keep afloat as the British player, and all these things kind of like pestering you and bothering you over the course of all the different games. So that's a really interesting part of that there. And then there's also like the betting part, where after the first scoring round you're trying to bet. That also is interesting, because kind of depending on how those event cards hit you will make you kind of bet differently. And also based on the kind of how the game's going after that first scoring card will make you kind of bet differently as well. Yeah, that one's tricky though, because the balancing of that is a little bit, you could always play it safe, for example. But you're never going to try, if you do that, you're probably never going to fully have an outright British victory, but you probably will definitely prevent an outright British loss, and it'll wind up in the middle, which is kind of the historical outcome. So that can be like a little bit, you know, sort of milquetoast if you were playing this campaign and somebody was always doing just, oh, concede, because it's not going to really wiggle that tracker too much. But on the other hand, if you're getting kind of hammered as the British player, you get a lot more of those negative event cards. Then you want to be able to have the opportunity to, you know, to have concessions and stuff like that. So that's an interesting dynamic there. But yeah, I definitely recommend this. This is honestly, at the end of the day, this might be my new favorite coin game. Cuba Libre's got some, you know, it's got some tough competition there, but this is so different and so interesting, and the campaign and everything, how it all ties together, just completely a breath of fresh air. I do know that the same designer is working on a different one set in South America and during the Cold War, which is interesting because they just announced that the other day. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was like, it'd be really cool to see a Cold War era one where it was like the two sides, the Soviets and the US, and then kind of working through the different theaters, maybe even going through some of the other coin games that have existed and kind of redoing those in like lighter versions or something. And then you'd have a tug of war between the prestige of the Soviets versus the US or NATO or something. So I think there's a lot of really interesting, larger dynamics between coin and insurgency and that kind of thing that could be explored through these multi-packs. Just really, really cool stuff. So anyway, I can't recommend this enough. It's great if you're a beginner. If you played a bunch of these, the campaign and all the different like little weird nuances of each game is going to be interesting. So definitely take a look. Thanks.